Welcome back, Midnight Stories family. Get ready for another heart-touching tale. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Now let's dive into today's story. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm amber glow through the living room window, John settled into his favorite armchair. The familiar creak of the leather and the soft hum of the evening news provided a comforting backdrop to his thoughts. Yet tonight an unsettling feeling gnawed at him, disrupting the tranquility he usually found at this hour. Mary, his wife of 35 years, was in the kitchen, her silhouette moving gracefully as she prepared dinner. The clinking of dishes and the aroma of roasted chicken filled the air, evoking memories of countless shared meals and laughter. Their life together had been a tapestry woven with threads of trust, companionship, and shared dreams. They had raised 2 children, now grown with families of their own, and had weathered life's storms side by side. But recently, subtle changes had begun to disturb the fabric of their daily routine. Mary had taken to evening walks, something she rarely did before. She mentioned needing fresh air or wanting to clear her mind, explanations that seemed plausible yet left John with a lingering sense of unease. One evening, curiosity got the better of him. He decided to join her on her walk, hoping to share in this new interest. "Mind if I come along?" he had asked, attempting to keep his tone light. Mary's response was unexpectedly hesitant. "Oh, it's just my quiet time," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "I use it to think and unwind. Maybe another time?" Her reluctance stung, but John nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course I understand." As he watched her retreating figure disappear down the driveway, a knot tightened in his stomach. The woman he had shared his life with, who had been an open book, now seemed to be guarding a chapter from him. Determined to dismiss his suspicions as unfounded, John tried to focus on his hobbies. Yet, the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew with each passing day. He began to notice other anomalies, hushed phone conversations that abruptly ended when he entered the room, a new perfume he hadn't seen before, and an increased number of girls' nights that left him dining alone. One Saturday afternoon, while tidying up the study, John stumbled upon a receipt tucked between the pages of a novel Mary had been reading. It was from an upscale restaurant across town, dated 2 weeks prior, a night she had claimed to be at a book club meeting. His heart pounded as he stared at the receipt, the elegant script of the restaurant's name mocking his ignorance. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls bearing silent witness to his dawning realization. That evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, John studied Mary's face, the familiar lines, the eyes that once sparkled with unguarded affection. He searched for answers in her expression, but she remained an enigma, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. The weight of unspoken words hung heavily between them, and John felt the chasm widening. The life he thought he knew, the woman he believed he understood, now seemed shrouded in uncertainty. As the sun set behind the curtains, casting long shadows in the room, John realized that the trust he had always taken for granted was now overshadowed by doubt. The foundation of their marriage, built over decades, felt as though it was beginning to crumble beneath the weight of secrets. John and Mary's story began long before gray streaked their hair and wrinkles etched their faces with the weight of time. Their meeting was the kind of serendipitous moment people tell their grandchildren about. It was a crisp autumn evening when John, then a young engineer just out of college, locked eyes with Mary at a community dance. She wore a simple blue dress that swayed with her every step, her laughter light and melodic. For John, it was as though the world had stopped spinning just to draw his attention to her. They married a year later, merging their lives with dreams of a future filled with shared joys. Over the decades, they built a life together brick by brick. A modest home that echoed with laughter, 2 children who grew into strong, independent adults, and countless memories of road trips, family gatherings, and quiet evenings spent in each other's company. But marriage, as John often said, was not without its challenges. There were arguments over finances, sacrifices made for the children, and moments of strain when life became overwhelming. Yet they had always found their way back to one another. For John, this resilience was a testament to their enduring love. Mary had been the center of his world. Her laugh could lift his spirits even on the darkest days, and her touch was a soothing balm to his worries. He trusted her implicitly, never doubting her loyalty. But as the years stretched on, subtle shifts began to occur. Mary's demeanor had changed recently. The spark that once lit her eyes when she saw him had dimmed. Her laugh, though still lovely, felt distant, as though she was sharing it with someone else in her mind. John first noticed it during one of their quiet dinners. "Mary, you've been quiet these days," he remarked gently, placing his hand over hers. "Is everything all right?" She had smiled, but it felt rehearsed. "I'm fine, John. Just tired, I suppose." It was a plausible answer, yet something about her tone left him unsettled. Mary was always an open book, but now some pages felt glued shut. There were new habits too. Her sudden interest in evening walks, the late-night text messages she quickly dismissed as from friends, and a perfume he didn't recognize lingering on her clothes. John, for his part, tried to attribute these changes to his imagination. After all, their lives had grown comfortable, perhaps too comfortable. He wondered if he had been neglecting her in ways he hadn't realized. He worked hard to ensure their retirement plans were secure, but maybe he thought he had forgotten to nurture the intimacy that once defined their relationship. One evening he decided to take action. "Mary," he said over dinner, "why don't we plan a weekend away? Just the two of us. It's been a while since we've done something spontaneous." Her fork paused midair, and for a brief moment, a shadow of discomfort crossed her face. "That sounds lovely, John," she replied, though her enthusiasm seemed forced. "But work is busy right now. Maybe in a few weeks?" John nodded, hiding his disappointment. "Of course. Whenever you're ready." But weeks turned into months, and her excuses piled up. John began to notice more glaring signs. Whispered phone calls that ended abruptly when he walked into the room, an unfamiliar scarf tucked in her car, and the growing number of evenings she claimed to spend with her book club. The receipt from the restaurant was the final straw. Dated 2 weeks prior, it bore the name of an upscale establishment where couples often celebrated anniversaries. Yet, Mary had told him she was at a friend's house that night. The discrepancy gnawed at him, the seed of doubt now a full-grown tree with branches stretching into every corner of his mind. That evening he confronted her. "Mary," he began cautiously, his voice steady but laced with pain, "I found this in your book." He placed the receipt on the table between them. Mary's eyes widened, her hand instinctively moving to cover her mouth. "John, Don't," he interrupted, his tone firmer now. "Please don't insult me by lying." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she said nothing, the silence deafening. John leaned back in his chair, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. 35 years, Mary. I never thought I'd have to question your loyalty." Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "It's not what you think, John." "Then what is it?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been keeping secrets." Mary's silence spoke louder than any confession. In that moment, John felt a deep ache in his chest, a fissure cracking through the foundation of their life together. He had always believed that their love was unshakable, but now, it felt fragile, like glass teetering on the edge of a table. As he stared at the woman he had devoted his life to, John couldn't help but wonder, when did the love they shared become something she could betray? And more importantly, could it ever be salvaged? Mary's betrayal did not start with grand gestures or blatant disregard. It began with the smallest of interactions, polite smiles exchanged over the coffee machine, innocent compliments on a new blouse, and shared laughter over an inside joke. Her colleague Daniel was charming and attentive in ways John hadn't been in years. Unlike John, who had grown accustomed to their rhythm of familiarity, Daniel made her feel seen again. At first she dismissed the butterflies. They were ridiculous, a juvenile reaction unbefitting a woman her age. But the conversations with Daniel began to linger in her mind long after they ended. His words were a balm to her feelings of monotony, his attention a spark in the dimness of routine. One evening after work, Mary found herself lingering by the office door. Daniel caught her eye and smiled. "Heading out late again? You're a hard worker, Mary." She laughed, brushing off the compliment. "Just trying to keep up with you." He tilted his head, his gaze soft but unwavering. "I doubt anyone could outshine you." The flattery caught her off guard. She felt her cheeks warm as she quickly turned away. "Good night, Daniel." But good night never truly ended the interaction. The following days were filled with small gestures. Daniel offering her coffee in the morning, complimenting her hair, or noticing the effort she put into her work. His attentiveness filled a void she hadn't realized was there. And when he asked her to join him for lunch one day, her hesitation was fleeting. "It's just lunch," she told herself as she accepted the invitation. Yet, sitting across from him in the quaint restaurant, she felt a thrill she hadn't experienced in years. Daniel leaned in as he spoke, his voice low and engaging. He asked about her dreams, her favorite books, and the things that made her smile. John hadn't asked those questions in decades. For weeks, their connection remained subtle. A text here, a shared smile there. But one evening, when Daniel reached for her hand as they crossed the street after work, the unspoken boundaries between them began to blur. His touch was electric, sending a jolt of guilt and desire coursing through her. Mary pulled her hand away, her voice shaking. "We shouldn't. I'm married." Daniel's expression softened, and he nodded. "I know. I respect that. I can't help how I feel about you." Her heart raced. The weight of his words lingered in the air, and though she walked away that night, the memory of his touch and his confession stayed with her. For Mary, the risks of continuing her connection with Daniel were monumental. If John ever found out, their marriage would crumble. Their children, now with families of their own, would be devastated. The social circles they navigated would buzz with judgment and gossip. And yet, the pull of her desires, the need to feel alive again, was overpowering. Daniel, too, faced his share of risks. As a younger colleague, he knew the consequences of being involved with a married woman in a small town. Rumors could destroy his reputation and career. But he was drawn to Mary's quiet strength and the vulnerability she tried to hide. To him, she was more than a fleeting affair. She was someone worth risking it all for. The tension between them escalated one night when Daniel invited Mary to a colleague's farewell party. John had asked her to join him for dinner that evening, but Mary told him she had a work obligation. The lie rolled off her tongue effortlessly, and the guilt didn't set in until she was in Daniel's car, driving to the party. At the event, surrounded by strangers, Daniel and Mary found themselves drawn to the shadows of the balcony. The cool night air wrapped around them as they stood close, the din of the party fading into the background. "I shouldn't be here," Mary whispered, her voice heavy with regret. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm but gentle. "But you are. Doesn't that mean something?" She looked into his eyes, searching for an answer she wasn't ready to admit. Before she could respond, Daniel leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. The kiss was tender and brief, but it left her trembling. She pulled away, her breath shallow. "I can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. "It's too much." Daniel nodded, his expression pained. "I understand. But I can't pretend I don't care about you." The drive home was silent, Mary's mind a whirlwind of emotions. The kiss had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "I'm sorry. Take care." The guilt was unbearable, yet a part of her longed to see him again. She knew she was standing at the edge of a precipice, one wrong step away from losing everything she had built with John. But the thrill of something new, something forbidden, clouded her judgment. What started as a harmless exchange was quickly spiraling into something far more dangerous. Mary found herself tangled in a web of lies, each one pulling her further from the life she had once cherished. The weight of her choices bore down on her, but the allure of Daniel's attention made it impossible to stop. The stakes had never been higher, and the cracks in her marriage were becoming impossible to ignore. Mary had become adept at hiding the growing entanglement with Daniel, but the weight of her lies pressed heavier with each passing day. John, ever observant, began to piece together subtle inconsistencies in her behavior, details that seemed small in isolation but painted an alarming picture when combined. One evening, as Mary prepared to leave for her book club, John noticed her attire with quiet scrutiny. She had slipped into a sleek black dress he hadn't seen her wear in years. Her hair was perfectly styled, her lips painted a deep red, and the faint scent of a new perfume lingered in the room. "Book club sure has gotten fancy," he remarked, forcing a casual tone as he sipped his tea. Mary froze for a moment before recovering with a laugh. "All this? I just felt like dressing up a little. Nothing wrong with feeling good, right?" John tilted his head, his gaze steady. "You should take a picture. The kids would love to see how stunning their mom looks." Her smile faltered and she glanced at the clock. "I'll be late if I don't leave now." "Don't wait up." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving John with a sinking feeling in his chest. Something wasn't right. The warmth that once defined their relationship had grown cold, replaced by an unease that gnawed at his thoughts. He stared at the empty doorway, the silence of the house amplifying his doubts. The cracks in Mary's story widened the following week. While cleaning out the car's glove compartment, John discovered a small velvet box tucked beneath a pile of receipts. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet engraved with initials that weren't his. He stared at it, his heart pounding as his mind raced with questions. It wasn't their anniversary, and Mary hadn't mentioned buying a gift for anyone. That evening he placed the box on the kitchen counter, its presence an unspoken challenge. When Mary walked in and spotted it, her face drained of color. "Oh," she stammered, forcing a smile. "I meant to tell you. It's for a colleague's farewell. I thought a bracelet would make a nice gesture." John crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "A personal touch for a colleague? That's thoughtful." She fidgeted with her necklace, her laughter brittle. "Well, she's been a good friend at work." "She?" John pressed, his voice calm but firm. Mary hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. "Yes, Sheila. You know how much I value her advice." John nodded, saying nothing more, but the doubt in his heart deepened. The truth felt just out of reach, a shadow lurking at the edges of his understanding. The tension between them grew unbearable. Mary's phone buzzed late into the night with messages she dismissed as work-related. Her once easy laughter now felt forced, and her gaze often avoided his. John began to notice patterns: her eagerness to leave the house, the hurried way she ended phone calls when he entered the room. One evening, as John walked toward the kitchen for a glass of water, he heard Mary's voice, low and urgent. "You can't keep calling like this," she whispered. "It's too risky." John froze, his hand tightening around the glass. He heard a faint, indistinct reply on the other end of the line before Mary added, "I'll see you tomorrow. Just stop texting so much." When Mary turned and saw him standing there, her face turned pale. "Oh, John. I didn't hear you. Just Sheila, work stress, you know how it is." John nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "Sure, Sheila." His voice carried no emotion, but the unspoken tension hung heavy in the air. They stood in silence, each aware of the widening chasm between them. As Mary's guilt grew, so did Daniel's boldness. He began to leave notes on her desk and small gifts in her car, tokens of affection that thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. One afternoon, John went to retrieve the mail and found a package addressed to Mary. Inside was a silk scarf and a handwritten note. "Can't wait to see you in this. D." John's hands shook as he read the note, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The betrayal he had suspected now felt undeniable. That evening, he waited for Mary to return, the note clutched in his hand like evidence in a trial. When she walked through the door, he held it out to her without a word. Her eyes widened as she read it, her face a portrait of guilt. "John," she began, her voice trembling. "It's not what you think." "Then explain it," he said, his tone cold and measured. "Because it looks like you've been sharing more than office gossip with this D." Tears filled her eyes, but she couldn't find the words to deny it. John's voice rose, the pain in his heart spilling into his words. 35 years, Mary. 35 years of trust, of building a life together. Was that not enough for you?" "It's complicated," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of her guilt. "Complicated?" John echoed bitterly. "Do you know what's complicated? Spending your life with someone who's lying to your face." Mary's silence was deafening, her guilt etched in every line of her face. She turned away, unable to meet his gaze. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said, her voice barely audible. John shook his head, his disbelief mingling with despair. "I don't even know who you are anymore." In the days that followed, their home became a battleground of avoidance and unspoken accusations. Mary's attempts to maintain her double life grew increasingly desperate, while John pieced together the fragments of evidence that confirmed his worst fears. Every unanswered question, every suspicious behavior, widened the rift between them. Mary found herself walking a tightrope, her fear of exposure overshadowed by Daniel's relentless persistence. He began showing up unannounced at her office, his gestures growing bolder. The thrill of secrecy that had once excited her now felt like a noose tightening around her neck. Meanwhile, John wrestled with his own torment. He replayed every moment of their life together, searching for signs he had missed, wondering where things had gone so wrong. The weight of his suspicions became unbearable, and with every passing day, the cracks in their fragile peace grew deeper. With every unanswered question, his doubts grew stronger, and so did the cracks in their fragile peace. The night John finally uncovered the full scope of Mary's betrayal was one he would never forget. The day had started like any other, a quiet breakfast at the kitchen table, John reading the newspaper while Mary prepared her coffee. But the atmosphere was charged with tension. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts, avoiding the growing chasm that had taken root between them. That evening, John sat in his study, unable to shake the gnawing sense that there was something he was missing, something Mary hadn't yet let slip. Her excuses, her hesitations, they all pointed to a truth she was desperate to hide. He had to know. He needed to confirm the suspicions that had consumed his every waking thought. Mary had left for Herd Book Club again, but this time, John decided to follow her. He felt a pang of guilt for the invasion of her privacy, but it was drowned out by the relentless ache of doubt. Slipping into his car, he trailed her at a distance as she drove across town, her car eventually pulling into the parking lot of an upscale restaurant. From the shadows of his own vehicle, John watched her step out of the car, dressed in a bold red dress he hadn't seen in years. She hesitated near the entrance, glancing around nervously. Moments later, a man approached, tall, well-dressed, with an easy confidence. John's stomach churned as he saw them embrace, the man placing a hand on Mary's lower back as they walked inside together. For several moments, John sat frozen, the weight of the scene crushing him. His mind raced through the years they'd shared, the sacrifices he'd made, the love he thought was unshakable. This was his wife, the woman he had trusted implicitly, now tangled in an embrace with another man. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He couldn't sit idle. Not now. Gathering his resolve, he stepped out of the car and followed them inside. The restaurant was warm and dimly lit, with soft music playing in the background. John scanned the room until he found them seated in a secluded corner booth. Mary leaned in close to the man, her hand brushing against his arm as they talked. Their smiles, their body language, it was unmistakable. This wasn't a platonic meeting. This was betrayal in its rawest form. John's chest burned with anger and heartbreak as he approached their table. Mary's laughter died in her throat when she looked up and saw him standing there. "John?" she whispered, her face paling. The man looked between them, confused, but John's eyes never left Mary. "So this is your book club?" he said, his voice low but filled with venom. "Who is this?" the man asked, his tone uneasy. "I'm her husband," John said coldly, his gaze piercing. "And you must be Daniel?" Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but John cut him off, his voice rising. "Save it. I've seen enough." Mary stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "John, please. Let me explain." "Explain?" John's voice cracked with the weight of his emotions. "Explain what, Mary? That you've been sneaking around behind my back? That you've been lying to my face every day for God knows how long?" The restaurant had fallen silent, the other patrons staring at the unfolding scene. Mary's eyes brimmed with tears, but John couldn't stop. 35 years, Mary. 35 years of marriage. Of trust. Of building a life together. And this is how you repay me? Daniel stood, attempting to intervene. "Listen, man, maybe we should talk about this somewhere else." John turned on him, his voice sharp as a blade. "You don't get to tell me where or how I handle this. You've already done enough." Daniel raised his hands in surrender, backing away slightly, but John's attention was back on Mary. "I gave you everything, Mary. I trusted you. Was it not enough? Was I not enough?" Mary's voice trembled as she finally spoke. "John, I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to happen like this. I never meant to hurt you." "Hurt me?" John laughed bitterly, his voice shaking with anger and grief. "You've destroyed me, Mary. You've destroyed everything we built." The drive home was silent, the air in the car heavy with unspoken words. Mary's tears fell quietly, but John kept his gaze fixed on the road, his mind replaying the night's events over and over. By the time they reached the house, the tension was unbearable. Inside, John turned to face her, his voice cold and steady. "How long has this been going on?" Mary hesitated, her silence an admission of guilt. "A few months," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "A few months," John repeated, his fists clenching. "And you looked me in the eye every day and lied to me?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said desperately. "I was lonely, John. I felt invisible. And Daniel, He made me feel alive again. John's laughter was harsh, filled with pain. Alive? You felt alive by betraying the man who devoted his life to you? Do you even hear yourself? Mary stepped closer, reaching for him, but he pulled away. Don't, he said, his voice breaking. Don't touch me. John, please, she begged. I made a mistake, but it doesn't erase everything we've shared. Everything we've built. John's eyes filled with tears as he looked at her. You've destroyed it, Mary. You took our life, our trust, and you threw it away. How do we come back from that? How do I ever look at you the same way again? Mary had no answer, her sobs filling the silence between them. John turned away, the weight of his heartbreak too much to bear. In a single moment, he thought, the life I thought I knew was turned upside down. The morning after the confrontation, John sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him. The house felt suffocatingly quiet, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards as Mary moved about upstairs. The weight of the previous night's revelation hung heavy in the air, an invisible barrier between them. He heard her footsteps approach before she spoke. John, can we talk? He didn't look up. Talk? I think you've said enough. She pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down, her hands trembling as they rested on the table. I know I've hurt you. And I know I've broken your trust. But You don't know, Mary, John interrupted, his voice rising. You have no idea what it feels like to have the person you've built your entire life around betray you. 35 years, Mary. 35 years. Do you even understand what you've thrown away? Tears streamed down her face, but John's anger was unrelenting. Was it worth it? All those nights sneaking around, lying to me, to our family. Was he worth it? It wasn't about him, she whispered. It was about me. I felt invisible, John. I felt like I didn't matter anymore. John scoffed, his frustration boiling over. Invisible? Do you think I didn't feel the same way sometimes? Marriage isn't always exciting, Mary, but we made vows. We promised to work through it together. You didn't even give me a chance. Her voice cracked as she tried to explain. I didn't know how to tell you. You've always been so steady, so sure of everything. I thought if I told you how I felt, you'd think I was ungrateful. John's laugh was bitter. Ungrateful doesn't even begin to cover it. For the next few days, the tension in the house was unbearable. They avoided each other, their conversations limited to the bare minimum. John buried himself in tasks, fixing things around the house he'd ignored for months, while Mary wandered the house aimlessly, the guilt weighing on her like a lead blanket. Their children, sensing something was amiss, called to check in. Dad, is everything okay? Their eldest daughter Rachel asked. You and Mom have been off? John hesitated. It's nothing, Rachel. Just a rough patch. But Rachel wasn't convinced. Dad, you've always told us that communication is key. Whatever it is, you need to talk to her. Fix it? He wanted to laugh at the irony of her words but bit his tongue. I'll handle it, he said, ending the call quickly. Meanwhile, Mary grappled with the fallout of her choices. She tried to reach out to Daniel, hoping to make sense of what had happened, but he had gone silent. The messages she sent went unanswered, and the realization that she was now alone in her guilt hit her hard. One afternoon, she found herself pacing the living room when John walked in, his face lined with exhaustion. What's your plan, Mary? He asked bluntly. She looked at him, confused. Plan? Are you staying? Are you leaving? What do you want, Mary? His voice was steady but cold, each word cutting like a knife. I don't know, she admitted, tears filling her eyes again. I want to fix this, John. I want us to find a way back to each other. John shook his head, his frustration bubbling over. You want to fix this? After everything? Do you even hear yourself? You're the one who broke it. One evening, John's frustration reached its peak. He drove to Daniel's office, unable to suppress the anger boiling inside him. The receptionist looked startled when John stormed in. I need to speak to Daniel, he said sharply. Do you have an appointment? She asked nervously. John's glare could have cut through steel. No, but I'm sure he'll want to see me. When Daniel finally appeared, his face paled at the sight of John. I don't think this is the place. Save it, John snapped. You had no problem sneaking around with my wife, but now you're too cowardly to face me? Daniel glanced around nervously. Look, I never meant for things to go this far. That's the problem with people like you, John said, his voice low and venomous. You don't think about the consequences until it's too late. Back at home, the confrontation weighed heavily on John. He sat alone in the darkened living room, the memories of his life with Mary playing like a slideshow in his mind. Their wedding day, the births of their children, the countless holidays and quiet evenings spent together, it all felt like a cruel joke now. When Mary walked in, she found him staring at an old photo album. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. "Trying to remember what it felt like to trust you," he replied without looking up. Her breath hitched and she sat beside him, her hands trembling. "John, please. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I can't lose you. I can't lose what we've built." He closed the album and looked at her, his expression weary. "Do you even understand what you're asking of me? Forgiveness isn't a switch I can flip, Mary. You shattered my trust. It'll take more than words to fix that. I'll do whatever it takes," she said desperately. "Therapy, counseling, anything." John stood, his voice quiet but firm. "I need time, Mary. Time to figure out if I can even look at you without seeing betrayal." The days turned into weeks and their relationship remained in limbo. John struggled with the pain of her betrayal, while Mary grappled with the guilt of her actions. The weight of their choices was heavier than they had ever imagined, and the path to healing seemed impossibly long. Could they rebuild what was broken, or had too much damage been done? Only time would tell. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of the television in the living room where John sat. The bottle of whiskey on the coffee table was nearly empty, and the silence was deafening. For weeks, his nights had been sleepless, haunted by the image of Mary and Daniel together, their betrayal replaying in his mind like a cruel film on an endless loop. But tonight was different. Tonight, John had decided there would be no more doubts, no more unanswered questions. He had made a decision. He was going to confront Mary and Daniel, together. Mary arrived home later than usual, her face pale and drawn. She had sensed the shift in John's demeanor over the past few days, the way his anger seemed to simmer just below the surface. She found him sitting in the living room, staring at the blank television screen. "You're late," he said, his voice flat. I had to stay late at work," she replied, avoiding his gaze. John stood abruptly, his movements sharp and deliberate. "Work? Is that what we're calling it now?" Mary froze, her heart racing. "John, Save it," he interrupted, grabbing his jacket. "You're coming with me." "What? Where?" she asked, panic rising in her chest. "You'll see," he said coldly, his grip firm as he took her arm and led her to the car. The drive was tense, the silence between them palpable. Mary glanced at John, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. She wanted to ask where they were going, but the look in his eyes silenced her. They pulled up outside a small apartment complex, and Mary's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the building immediately. It was Daniel's. Her hands began to tremble. "John, please don't do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You should have thought of that before," he replied, his tone icy. "Now get out." John pounded on the door with a force that startled even himself. The sound echoed through the hallway, and after a moment, the door creaked open. Daniel stood there, his expression shifting from surprise to fear as he saw John and Mary standing on the threshold. "John," Daniel began, his voice unsteady. "This isn't—" "Shut up," John barked, stepping inside and forcing Daniel to back away. "I'm not here to listen to your excuses." Mary followed hesitantly, tears streaming down her face. "John, please." "No, Mary," John said, his voice rising. "You wanted this man? You lied to me for him. So let's hear it. Let's hear why you threw away 35 years of marriage for this." Daniel raised his hands defensively. "Look, John, I never wanted to come between you two." John laughed bitterly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, you didn't? So what were you doing exactly? Playing house with my wife while I sat at home like a fool?" "John, stop," Mary pleaded. "This isn't helping." "Helping?" John turned to her, his eyes blazing. "You want to talk about helping? You're the one who destroyed this, Mary. You're the one who turned our marriage into a lie." Daniel tried to interject. "Maybe we should all just calm down?" John's fist slammed into the wall next to Daniel's head, cutting him off. "Don't you dare tell me to calm down," he growled. "You don't get to play the victim here." The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Mary sobbed quietly, her hands covering her face, while Daniel stood frozen, too afraid to move. Finally John stepped back, his chest heaving. "You disgust me," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Both of you?" He turned to Mary, his eyes filled with pain. "You were my world, Mary. I trusted you with everything I had. And you threw it all away for, what? For this?" Mary tried to speak, but her words came out as a broken whisper. "John, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try." John shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "You don't fix this, Mary. You can't. The damage is done." He walked to the door, pausing for a moment before turning back. "I hope it was worth it." With that, he left, the sound of the door slamming behind him echoing in the silence. John drove aimlessly for hours, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on him. He pulled over to the side of a deserted road, his hands gripping the steering wheel as sobs racked his body. The anger, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it all came crashing down at once. Back at the apartment, Mary sat on the couch, her face buried in her hands. Daniel stood awkwardly nearby, unsure of what to say. Finally, Mary looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "This was a mistake," she said, her voice hollow. Daniel frowned. "Mary?" "No," she interrupted, shaking her head. "I ruined my marriage for this, and for what? You're not worth it. None of this was worth it." Daniel looked taken aback but said nothing as Mary grabbed her coat and walked out the door, leaving him standing alone in the apartment. When Mary returned home, she found the house empty. John's car was gone, and the silence was deafening. She sat in the living room, staring at the family photos on the mantel, the weight of her choices crushing her. Hours later, John finally returned, his face etched with exhaustion and grief. He didn't speak as he walked past her, heading straight to the bedroom. Mary followed, standing in the doorway as he began packing a suitcase. "John, please," she begged. "Don't do this." He paused, looking at her with a mixture of love and heartbreak. "I can't stay here, Mary. Not right now. Maybe not ever." Her voice broke as she asked, "Is this the end?" John hesitated, his eyes glistening with tears. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I need time to figure it out." As he walked out the door, Mary collapsed onto the bed, her sobs echoing in the empty room. The life they had built together was shattered, and whether it could ever be rebuilt remained uncertain. The days following John's departure were marked by a silence so profound it seemed to echo through every corner of the house. Mary moved through their home like a ghost, her once vibrant world now colorless and hollow. The family photos on the mantel mocked her, each smile a painful reminder of the life she had destroyed. The empty chair at the kitchen table was a glaring void, and every creak of the floorboards made her think, for just a moment, that John had come back. But he hadn't. And she wasn't sure he ever would. John, on the other hand, found himself in a small motel on the edge of town. The room was bare, a single bed, a flickering TV, and a desk with a wobbling leg. It was a far cry from the warmth of the home he had shared with Mary, but it was all he could manage. He needed distance. Space to think. Each night, he sat by the window, staring at the highway that stretched into the horizon. His thoughts were a jumble of anger, heartbreak, and confusion. How had their life come to this? Had there been signs he had missed? Was Mary's betrayal a reflection of his own failings as a husband? He thought back to the early years of their marriage when their love had been a force of nature, reckless, consuming, and full of promise. They had been a team facing life's challenges together. But somewhere along the way they had grown complacent, their connection dulled by routine and the weight of unspoken grievances. Mary's days blurred together as she tried to navigate the fallout of her choices. She reached out to their children, desperate for a sense of normalcy, but their reactions only deepened her shame. Rachel's voice on the phone had been cold. "How could you do this to Dad?" "To us?" she demanded. "I made a mistake," Mary admitted, her voice trembling. "But I never stopped loving your father." "Love?" Rachel's laugh was bitter. "You don't destroy someone you love. Do you have any idea what this has done to him? To all of us?" Her son, Michael, had been less confrontational but no less disappointed. "Mom," he said quietly, "Dad didn't deserve this. I don't know how you come back from something like this." Mary's heart broke with every word, but she couldn't argue. She had betrayed not only her husband but the family they had built together. She spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the moments that had led to her downfall. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John found himself driving aimlessly, his car winding through familiar streets. He didn't plan on stopping, but before he realized it, he was parked outside their house. The lights were on, and through the window he could see Mary sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. Against his better judgment, he stepped out of the car and walked to the door. When he knocked, Mary looked up, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. She opened the door slowly, her eyes red and swollen. "John?" she whispered. "You're here." "I'm not staying," he said quickly, his tone firm. I needed to see you. To talk." Mary stepped aside, letting him in. The house smelled the same, but it felt different. The warmth he had always associated with their home was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating tension. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the silence between them deafening. Finally John spoke. "Why, Mary?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you do it?" Mary took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "I don't know, John. I wish I had an answer that made sense. I was lonely. I felt invisible. And Daniel made me feel like I mattered again." John's jaw tightened. "You mattered to me, Mary. Maybe I didn't say it enough or show it the way you needed, but you mattered." Tears streamed down her face. "I know. And I threw it all away. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know how sorry I am." John looked at her, his own tears threatening to fall. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Mary. Sorry doesn't erase the lies, the betrayal. I can't just forget what you did." "I'm not asking you to forget," she said softly. "I'm asking you to let me try to make it right." Over the next few weeks, they began the slow, painful process of untangling their lives. Mary suggested counseling, and though John was reluctant, he agreed. Their sessions were raw and emotional, forcing them to confront the fractures in their relationship that had long been ignored. In one session, the counselor asked John a question that stayed with him. "Do you think you can ever trust her again?" John's answer was hesitant. "I don't know. Trust doesn't come back easily. But maybe it's worth trying." For Mary, the sessions were a chance to confront her own guilt and understand the deeper reasons behind her actions. She realized that her affair hadn't been about Daniel, it had been about her own insecurities and fears of growing older, of losing her sense of identity. Months passed, and though the wounds remained, they began to heal, slowly, cautiously. John moved back into the house, though he still slept in the guest room. They shared meals again, their conversations tentative but genuine. There were moments of hope, small glimmers of the connection they had once shared. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, John turned to Mary. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again?" Mary took his hand, her grip firm but gentle. "I don't know, John. But I'm willing to spend the rest of my life trying." The road ahead was uncertain, but they were walking it together. The scars of betrayal would never fully fade, but they had learned something important. Love isn't perfect, and it doesn't come without pain. But sometimes, in the face of heartbreak, it can find a way to survive. What would you do if the trust you built over decades was shattered in a single moment? Could you find it in your heart to forgive, or are some wounds too deep to heal? Relationships are fragile, but they are also resilient, if both sides are willing to fight for them. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence didn't offer John peace. It was a heavy, oppressive kind of quiet that reminded him of the weight of his indecision. He sat in his study, staring at the framed photograph on his desk. It was from their 25th wedding anniversary, a picture-perfect moment frozen in time. Mary's smile was wide and genuine, her hand resting on his shoulder. His own expression was one of pride and contentment. That life, that happiness now felt like a distant memory. John had always prided himself on being a man of principle. He believed in loyalty, honesty, and the sanctity of the vows he had made on a crisp autumn day 35 years ago. But now, those principles were in direct conflict with his emotions. Could he forgive Mary? Could he rebuild the trust that had been shattered? Or would forgiving her mean betraying himself? He reached for the glass of scotch on the desk, his hand trembling slightly. He had been sitting there for hours, replaying the events of the past months, trying to make sense of it all. The memories came in waves, some filled with love and laughter, others laced with pain and betrayal. Mary, meanwhile, sat in their bedroom, clutching one of John's old sweaters. It still carried his scent, a mix of cedarwood and aftershave that was so distinctly him. Tears streamed down her face as she wrestled with her own guilt. She had destroyed the one thing that had been her anchor through all of life's storms. How could she have been so blind, so selfish? Her thoughts drifted to the children. Rachel hadn't called in days, and Michael's last conversation had been curt and strained. The weight of their disappointment was suffocating. She had spent her life trying to be the rock for her family, the glue that held them together. And now she was the one who had torn them apart. The following evening they found themselves sitting at the dining table, the tension between them almost unbearable. The meal was untouched, the clinking of silverware against plates absent. Finally Mary broke the silence. "John," she began hesitantly, her voice shaking. "I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything. But I need to know, what are you thinking? What are we going to do?" John leaned back in his chair, his eyes tired and bloodshot. "I don't know, Mary. I honestly don't know. Please," she pleaded, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've broken your trust. But we've spent our entire lives together. Doesn't that mean something?" John's gaze hardened. "It does. It means you should have thought twice before throwing it all away." Mary flinched at his words, but she didn't back down. "I know I made a terrible mistake. But isn't love about more than just the good times? Isn't it about forgiveness too?" John's laugh was bitter, filled with pain. "Forgiveness? That's easy to say when you're the one asking for it. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To us? I look at you and all I can see is the woman who lied to me. The woman who betrayed me." Her voice broke as she whispered, "I hate myself for what I've done. But I love you, John. I've always loved you." After dinner, John went for a drive, needing space to think. The quiet hum of the car engine was a welcome reprieve from the storm raging in his mind. He found himself parked at the old park where he and Mary used to bring the kids when they were young. The swings creaked softly in the wind, and the distant sound of laughter from a nearby family tugged at his heart. He stepped out of the car and sat on one of the benches, staring up at the stars. His father's words echoed in his mind, a memory from years ago. "Marriage isn't about perfection, son. It's about commitment. There will be times when you'll want to walk away, but love is about choosing to stay." But what if staying meant sacrificing his own happiness? What if he could never look at Mary the same way again? The thought of living with that doubt, that pain, felt unbearable. Mary wasn't faring much better. She sat in the living room, the family photo album open on her lap. Each picture told a story: birthdays, anniversaries, vacations. Their life together had been rich and full, marked by moments of joy and connection. But now those memories felt tainted by her actions. She had not only betrayed John but also the family they had built, the legacy they had worked so hard to create. She thought about calling Rachel again, but the fear of rejection stopped her. Instead, she picked up a pen and began writing a letter to her children. The words came slowly at first, but soon they poured out in a torrent of emotion. John returned home late, finding Mary asleep on the couch, the letter clutched in her hand. He gently took it from her and unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words. "Dear Rachel and Michael, I don't know how to begin to apologize for the pain I've caused. I've let you down and I've let myself down. What I did was selfish and wrong and there are no excuses for it. But I want you to know that I've never stopped loving you or your father. He has been my rock, my partner, and my greatest blessing. Losing his trust is the greatest regret of my life. I only hope that one day you'll be able to forgive me, not for my sake but so we can begin to heal as a family. Love always, Mom." John's hands shook as he finished reading. The raw vulnerability in Mary's words stirred something in him, a flicker of the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. He stood there for a long moment, watching her sleep, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. The next morning they sat together in the living room, the letter on the coffee table between them. John cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I read it," he said quietly. Mary looked up, her eyes wide. What did you think?" "I think," he began, choosing his words carefully, "that you're right about one thing. We've spent our lives building something together. And maybe that's worth trying to save." Her breath caught, hope flickering in her eyes. "Does that mean?" "It means I'm willing to try," he said, his voice steady. "But it won't be easy. And it won't be quick. You need to understand that." "I do," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I'll do whatever it takes, John. I promise." The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges they couldn't yet foresee. But for the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope, a tentative step toward healing. The weight of their choices would never fully lift, but perhaps in time they could rebuild what had been broken. If you were in their shoes, could you live with the decisions they made? Every choice comes with a price, but some prices are too heavy to pay. Is forgiveness the ultimate act of love, or are some betrayals unforgivable?